this book.
On the back of the book, we're told that Grant has retired from a multifaceted career in consulting, counselling and education that has involved him in many public sectors projects around the world. His undergraduate studies were in science, maths, anthropology, economics, philosophy and phenomenology of religion, but he has postgraduate qualifications in guidance and counselling. And I know that Grant is not so well known to you folk here because he's based in Wellington. So thank you very much for coming up to talk to us about your book. In Wellington, over most of your career, you worked in change management with specialties in organisational culture change, group facilitation, project planning, education, business management, machinery of government, policy processes, and public administration reform, which seems a far cry from what we're talking about tonight. In retirement, you have decided to embark on this, researching, writing, and editing a series of books on your ancestors who were early missionaries in the Bay of Islands and Far North, and their place in history over the last 230 years. This book is the third in the series, and we look forward to some more. Grant brings to his writing a background of analysis and listening. The science, which I can appreciate, because my background is actually science and accounting, but the same analytical skills are very useful when it comes to history, asking those questions of how and why after you've established the basic of what, where, when and who. And change management, which has been a big part of your career, is really at the heart of what is happening at the time that you're writing about, with many people trying to manage that change. So you've got missionaries who've come in and wanting to introduce Christianity, big change. You have Māori who are receiving change but not knowing quite where that's going to lead, and trying to manage that process as well. So that was an interesting thing that was going on, and I'd really like you to explain yourself and the title. That's quite interesting.
Right. Thank you very much for that introduction. And thank you very much, Peter, for your talk. We're celebrating a launch that's already happened in many ways. And Adrienne, very kindly, after seeing my speech at the first launch, reminded me that what I should really be talking about was how I came to write it. Why am I writing this book? And what did I learn from the book, from writing it? And then what is the future? What is the purpose of publishing this book and getting it out to a readership? So that's what I'll talk about here tonight. So thank you for that recommendation. And you mentioned, Peter, about how important the translation role was in this particular conversation. And that really takes me back to why I wrote the book, because earlier on I'd written something about William Gilbert Puckey and his land purchases in Kaitaia, and I'd forwarded this to Adrienne, and having read her wonderful book on the brothers and their journey around the world, I was very interested in this chap William Gilbert Puckey and finding out more about this ancestor. And Adrienne introduced me to a chap, Barry Rigby, down in Wellington, who was a historian with Waitangi Tribunal. And he pointed me towards some work that Dame Joan Metch had done for the Murawhenua Land Tribunal, where she had accused Puckey of being a clumsy translator. And as a descendant, I was slightly irked by this. I thought, well, really? Was he clumsy? Because I'd always heard that he was actually fluent in Te Reo, that he had grown up as a boy of 14, arriving in 1819 on the General Gates in Kirikiri, that he had, through immersion, come to appreciate not just the language but the culture. But he hadn't done what Kendall had done and absorbed so much of the culture that he'd actually been converted himself. He stayed with his feet on the ground to some extent, where he was pushed in various taonui, where his family's possessions were stripped and the plates were broken. So he suffered from it in the encounter. So he had a very realistic understanding, I think, and experience of the space between the culture they were bringing and the culture they were meeting. And so when I, as Adrienne said, spotted this conversation in this massive material that we'd gathered up from the Hodgson, and I'd seen it before in Coleman's book at the end, and it was in that book, it's at the very end of the book, whereas when we were going through the Hodgson archives, we found it in its place in time, chronologically located as, this is a year after Davis has arrived. And reading it again and again, I did a transcription myself, Adrienne did a transcription, I proofread Adrienne's transcription, and then we were putting these into PDFs and putting them up on a website. But certain passages of this conversation jumped out to me. And the first one is one that Jeff's referred to in his talk at the Wellington launch, where after a discussion about how quickly the children, the rangatahi, are learning to read and learning what the book says, and the rangatira are saying, you know, they learn so quickly, and they learn everything. Just as us adults are surprised at how quickly our children learn to use computers, I suppose, and the digital natives. But anyway, the missionaries say, those that understand the book best in England are the greatest and most useful men. And shungi, in the sibilant tones that Te Reo was spoken then, and as they were heard and transcribed, turns to his countrymen and says words that Puckey translates as the gentlemanship of the English is not altogether derived from who their forefathers were, but from their great learning. And that struck me as being a very interesting thing. And I bumped into Samuel Carpenter in the Alexander Turnbull Library reading room. And I showed him this work that I was working on. And he looked at it and he said, gentlemanship, that's a very interesting word. And we agreed that it was probably a translation of the word rangatiratanga. So that was a very important insight. So the next passage that really struck me was Hihi. And Hihi, after a long passage from, obviously written by Henry Williams, giving, you know, full broadside, grape shot and cannon fire against the enemy, he comes up with these words which Puckey picks up and hears, which is not always the case when you have a facilitator or a translator. Sometimes people ignore things they don't want to hear. But his words, as Puckey translates them, were Your words press us down. You do not give us time to speak for ourselves. And the missionary said, well, we can but speak to you and express our great love. Is it not from love that we have thus addressed you? And here's Henry Williams justifying himself. And you can see that there's a drama emerging in this conversation. And Rewa, the other great rangatira from Kirikiri, says, it is true. Stop till we return from war, and we will learn all the good things. And this is a Shakespearean there's satire, there's so much in here, and I really want to get this whole conversation reenacted on stage and get the dynamics of this drama that are in this conversation. And then further on, there's one other passage where Shongi's nobility, his qualities of rangatiraship, rangatiratanga, come through. And there's a bit of a joke in here, I think. The missionary say, are you sure that neither of you here present will be killed if you go to fight? And Shongi says, can you tell which of us will be killed? He's teasing, I'm sure. And the missionary say, no, but in going to war, do you not rush, as it were, into the arms of death as from a frightful precipice? Which is like my mother saying, if someone else jumps off a cliff, are you going to jump off the cliff too? And Shongi rises, and this is Greek tragedy, I think, in here. He says, a man that hath a large, loving heart for his friends who have been killed will bid the world farewell and jump from the precipice. And this statement of the ethos of chieftainship, of warriorship, of rangatiratanga, this nobility, this honour, comes through so strong. So that's why I got into writing this book. And what I learned was, I learned why a book is called a work by its author. It's a lot of work. And luckily I had wonderful people helping me, editing, providing comment on the work. Adrienne, my friend Roger Steele, my publisher Lynn Peck, and my wife Liz, who all went through with a fine-tooth comb and told me which paragraphs were hard to understand, which pieces didn't flow, which parts I hadn't got quite right, and which quotes I had misattributed, and so on. So besides learning where the bodies are buried in terms of where all the archives are in the Hodgson Library and the Museum Library up here and the Alexander Turnbull Library in Wellington, I also happened to think, well, I should really go and check the date of this conversation and see which of these other named missionaries also were writing about this period. And I found in George Clark's journals in the Alexander Turnbull Library on the 15th of November, he describes the event about how Henry Williams came over and with William Puckey as the translator. And that was a key point because Dorothy Clower had suggested that it must have been James Shepherd that had been the translator, but I found that he had been away in Sydney at the time. And it again reinforced for me the fact that Puckey was not a clumsy translator, that he was actually a highly skilled translator and facilitator of this conversation, of this communication, of this bridging this space between the two cultures, really. And one morning I woke up and my subconscious must have been working on it, and I suddenly realised that Hongi had some English, and that by hearing his words repeated back to the missionaries in English that he had spoken in Te Rao, it's like having your words reflected back to you, which is counsel. That's the key intervention a counsellor makes, is to send back to you what you have said so that you can get a better understanding of what it is you're saying. And that the word rangatira, one of the other key things I learned was that the word rangatiratanga had then been used in the next 2 years, somewhere in there, in the Committee of Missionaries of Kerikeri, for the translation of that piece of text, which is like, I think, the disk operating system of the whole liturgy, the Lord's Prayer. And looking into that, finding out that in fact the Lord's Prayer goes back at least 2,000 years. It goes back to the Aramaic. And it's, when you think about it, it's the addressing the ultimate questions of existence. Where do we get our daily bread? Can we make conditions on earth as they are in some heaven that we can imagine? How do we treat each other? You know, all of these ethical questions are embodied. Now, as a child growing up, I learned the Lord's Prayer like all of us did, I suspect, and it became just a rote, and the words lose their meaning. So to revisit that text and to see rangatiratanga used for power suddenly brought to me a whole new understanding of how our two cultures are meeting and the possibilities for the future. So my purpose and intention, where to go from here, are firstly to, and I'm working on this, to set up a reenactment of this conversation, possibly using students who don't have any particular access to crime in this situation. And it would be nice to do it on the 15th of November at Kerikeri, but that may not be possible, but we'll see. And to film it and to make it more available to people generally. And I have a friend, Tana Kalamana, who's translating, and it's going through the process of review of the translation. So we can actually hear both the Te Reo and the English and see the dynamics played out in front of us. So that's my first big hope. But there's another whole area really of what does rangatiratanga mean for us today? What is the opportunity that it presents for considering what are the gentlemanship? What's that strata of society? Those people who have qualities of a rangatira. How can we make sure the knowledge, the wisdom, the experience, the mistakes those people have made, the lessons they have learned, how can they be brought back into and valued in our culture?